Plates, Idaho. Do you live around here? 8 or 9 blocks over. He hitched his chin toward the main road. On Toulouse. Frank Quinn. Cade Ryder. If the name meant anything to him, he didn't show it. I'm over here looking for my dog. A damned beagle. Got out again and took off after a squirrel or something, I don't know. Lines of worry furrowed his brow. I'm going to have to get a tracker for him or build a brand new fence. Don't suppose you saw him. Sorry. Cade shook his head. But I thought you might have been by that house there. The cottage with the red shutters? I was. In the backyard? No, but I peered over the fence. Didn't go through the gate. Nope. He scowled. Why? The gate was open. Was it? He rubbed his jaw, scraping his whiskers. I don't think so. I leaned against it, to look over. But you didn't unlatch it? No. Didn't want to risk trespassing. Well, unless I'd spied Monty. Then I would have. Did you see anyone else? In that yard? Coming out of the house. Nah, and I would have noticed because I was looking for, well, speak of the devil. His worried face cracked with a relieved smile as a small beagle appeared from the bushes of a house 3 doors down. Baying, he came running, bounding over puddles and splits in the sidewalk where tree roots had lifted and broken the concrete. So, the prodigal dog returns, you little pain in the ass, Quinn said, leaning down for the dog to jump into his waiting arms. You know you're a bad boy. White-tipped tail wagging like a whipsaw, Monty licked Quinn's silvery stubbled jaw. Yeah, as if you was looking for me, he said, opening the car door and setting the dog behind the wheel before shooing him over to the passenger side. He'd drive if I let him, but I make him settle for shotgun. Laughing at his own joke, Quinn slid into the car, then drove off. Innocent. Cade made his way back to the house and his pickup parked out front. Maybe he'd imagined it all. Maybe his nerves were jangled from the article in the paper about Luke Hollander's death, and then the homicide scene. Maybe everything was fine. Then again, maybe not. Rachel picked up a bouquet of daffodils from a roadside stand, then drove to the cemetery. The day was gray, which seemed fitting, and although the rain had subsided for the moment, the ground was sodden. The long, wet grass soaked the edges of her tennis shoes as she wended through the markers to find her brother's headstone, marking the spot where his ashes had been buried. A landscaper's truck was parked on one of the gravel lanes at the perimeter of Edgewater Pioneer Cemetery, and a man with a shovel was digging around one of the pine trees that marked the periphery of the graveyard. In another tree, a bold gray squirrel scolded from the pine's gnarled branches. Melinda Gaston was already here, a solemn figure standing on the rise where Luke's ashes were buried. In a long black coat and boots, her head bent, she seemed older than her years. The fingers of one hand curled over the handle of a folded umbrella that she was using to prop herself up as she stared down at her son's grave. Hey, Rachel said, as she approached and saw that her mother had been crying, her eyes red-rimmed, though she managed a thin smile. Hi, Melinda blinked, then turned to stare again at the ground where a bouquet of white roses marked Luke's grave. Rachel added her drooping daffodils. This is always such a hard day. Yeah, I know. I told myself I would stop coming. But I guess I'm not ready. She cleared her throat and added, I wonder if I'll ever be. I hope so. Me too. A gust of wind, thick with moisture, blew past, toying with the hem of Melinda's long coat, billowing its skirt around her slim legs. After a beat, her mother said, You know that I don't blame you, don't you? Yes. Melinda had said as much over the years. Try believing it. I do. Her mother eyed her. Then you should quit blaming yourself. I don't. The lie came easily. One of Melinda's eyebrows cocked, and though she still used the umbrella for support with one hand, she grabbed Rachel's fingers with her other, then squeezed gently. I felt that I lost 2 children that night, both my son and daughter. Luke, he was gone, yes, but you retreated. That wasn't quite true. Rachel had drawn away from her family, yes, guilt propelling her, and most of her friends had abandoned her after that night, caught up in their own lives. Rachel had found comfort and strength in Cade Ryder's arms when he'd come back to Edgewater. You and I, we lost more than Luke, her mother said, nearly inaudibly as the wind kicked up again. I'm working on that. Well, work on it a little harder, would you? It's been 20 years. Time to let go. Then she placed a gloved hand to her lips, kissed her fingers, and touched the edge of the gravestone. You need to move on. She was nodding. And so do I. Hesitating, she bit the edge of her lip, as if something were on her mind. Rachel asked, What? He's out, Melinda said softly, as rain began to fall again. Big fat drops that reminded Rachel of tears. God's tears, her grandmother used to tell her, for the fate of humanity. Rachel had never believed it. Who? She asked, eyeing her mother. Out from where? What was Melinda talking about? Bruce. Bruce? Rachel repeated before she understood. Bruce Hollander was Luke's biological father. Rachel had never met the man, a convict who'd been sent to prison before Rachel was born. Her dad, Ned Gaston, had worked the Hollander case as a rookie detective. Oh. Right. Oh. He contacted you? No, he can't. Or he's not supposed to, and so far he hasn't. I heard it from my attorney, who had been informed by Bruce's parole officer. Does Dad know? Melinda lifted a shoulder, and her face, if possible, grew grimmer. I don't know. You didn't tell him? A beat. More raindrops. We don't talk much. The understatement of the year. Maybe you should work on that. Melinda only whispered a noncommittal, Together they moved away from Luke's final resting spot, and she watched her mother cross the wet grass to the parking lot, where she'd left her car. Rachel had parked on the street, and as she climbed into her Explorer, she looked back at the cemetery and remembered that day so long ago when the shock was still fresh, her life in chaos as they'd laid her brother to rest. It seemed like a lifetime ago in some ways, though some details of those days were still vivid and painful. She watched her mother drive away and noticed the landscaping truck was gone as well. She was alone. On the seat beside her, Reno whined. It's okay, she said, reaching over to pat his neck, only to feel the stiff hairs at his nape at attention. What? The dog was staring through the rain-spattered windshield, eyes trained on the rise where Luke's ashes were buried. Rachel felt an unwelcome chill. You see the squirrel? But no, the chattering had stopped. The gray squirrel was gone and the cemetery was silent, aside from the plop of raindrops and the rush of the wind. Her throat went dry. She stared at the lonely hill and saw no one, and yet she had the feeling that she wasn't alone. You're spooking me, she whispered to the dog, and felt his shoulder muscles bunch. It's nothing. Just an empty graveyard on this gloomy day in May. Nothing, not one thing out of the ordinary. But as she started the Ford, its old engine turning over and catching, she couldn't quite convince herself. She reached for her phone, realized she'd left it charging in the kitchen, and pulled away from the curb. As she did, she noticed in her rearview mirror that a white car that had been parked farther down the street did the same. It followed her for a few blocks, caught behind her Explorer at the light. The driver was hunched over the wheel. his dark cap visible as the wipers slapped the raindrops off the glass, the dog on the passenger seat with its long snout sticking out of the partially open window. "Nothing, it's nothing, your nerves are shot." The light turned green, and she turned right, heading back home to grab her phone and make some calls before the meeting tonight. The white car followed, and she tried to make out the driver, a man, but did she know him? "It's just a stranger in a car you've never seen before, but no big deal. Get a grip, Rachel. It happens all the time, every damned day." But her heart was racing, and she hit the gas. The white car followed, increasing its speed, but keeping the same distance between them. That was weird, right? Or not? At the next intersection, rather than driving directly home, she turned away from the town, toward the highway, and sure enough, the white car followed. Don't panic. But she was, and she took a corner a little too fast, her vehicle sliding, tires screaming. "Pull yourself together." When she reached the highway, she barely stopped, just rolled through the light and punched it, the Explorer leaping forward and roaring away. Around a wide corner, she saw the back end of a lumbering travel coach, coasting along at 40. Through the rain, she saw no oncoming car, so she hit the gas and passed, the driver honking irritably. As it turned out, the coach was following a slow-moving pickup. She sped past both the coach and truck, then caught her wild eyes in the mirror. The road crested, and barreling in the opposite direction was a huge semi. "What are you doing, Rachel?" Her heart knocked, and she could barely breathe. She was a mother, an adult. She glanced in the rear view and saw that the white car had peeked its nose out from behind the RV, but ducked back as the driver saw the semi. "Good. Stay there," she said, then caught herself. What was wrong with her? She took in deep breaths, switched on the radio, and with one eye on the mirror turned at the next country road and drove into the hills, losing the white car. If it was really following you. She glanced at her reflection again. "Don't do this," she warned, then saw in her side view mirror the white car turn off of the highway. Chapter 7. "Violet is dead?" "Oh, God. No!" Rachel's voice squeaked. She stood in the kitchen, her jacket dripping, staring at the messages on her phone. From Cade, from Lila and Mercedes, all saying the same thing, all relaying horror and shock. No, it just couldn't be. She'd seen Violet not long ago at the gas station, her car idling, facing the opposite way, while Rachel was tanking up. Violet, a small dog on her shoulder, had managed a thin wave. Rachel had been in a hurry, always in a hurry at that time, late to pick up the kids at school. She didn't even remember waving back. And now she was gone? Rachel slid into one of the kitchen chairs and fired up her computer. But information so far was sketchy. Just a report that Violet Sperry had been found dead in her home by her husband early this morning. The police had been called and were making no comments as to the cause of death, only to say it was unexpected and under investigation. What did that mean? That foul play was suspected? That she'd been the victim of what? Homicide? Suicide? What? She dialed Cade's cell. And when he answered on the first ring, she said, "Hey, it's Rachel. Got your message about Violet. What happened?" "I was called to the scene this morning," he said. "Violet was dead, had been, for a few hours. Her husband found her in the house." "I can't believe it." "It's true." "How did she die?" "We're still waiting for an autopsy. County jurisdiction, but I'll be informed." "So, not natural causes?" "No." "Was it murder?" No reason to beat around the bush. "It looks like." "Jesus, Cade," she whispered, and she felt her blood chill in her veins. "Why?" "We don't know." "Of course." Rachel leaned against the counter. She'd been the daughter of a detective, then the wife of one. She understood. How is her husband? Oh, God, I don't even know him. He's the furniture guy, right?" "Leonard Sperry. Yes, works with the family business." He sighed. "I talked with him. He's not doing so great. In shock." "I bet," she said. "Aren't we all?" A pause. Then, I wanted you to know, so I came by earlier to tell you in person. You weren't there. Something in his voice caught her attention. Running errands. Actually, limping, the Explorer had a flat. Fixed now. He hesitated again. What was that all about? And? She encouraged. And I was worried about you, wanted you to hear it from me, and so I let myself in. You mean you let yourself in as into the house? She asked, stunned. My house? Yeah. She couldn't believe it. Really? You knew I wasn't here and you just walked right in? How? But she already got it. He had a key. She'd never changed the locks because if he needed to get in for the kids. Oh, hell. Wow, Kate. You can't just come busting into my home. You know that. I said I was worried. One of your classmates was dead, probably murdered on the anniversary of your brother's death. There was the article in the newspaper, and you think I'm so mentally unstable, so crazy I couldn't deal with it, she charged, her temper skyrocketing. That's not what I said. It's what you thought, she spat out, with more venom than she'd expected. Calm down. Don't add fuel to the fire. You don't know what I thought, but I can tell that you're just fine. That's right, I am, she snapped, then caught herself and said, No, I'm sorry. Overreacting. You're right. Everything today is shocking, terrible, ramped up because of the day, probably. With difficulty, she tamped down the fury that had spurted through her veins. He was just trying to help, and Violet was dead, killed. Calmer, she said, I'm surprised you came into the house, that's all. We had a deal, right? Only if there was an emergency. And your friend's death doesn't qualify? She wasn't going to be baited. Look, you can't come in here, Kate. Unless you think there's a danger to the kids, got it? We're divorced. I know. She glanced around the room with the new knowledge that he'd been in here. Maybe looking at her phone and computer and God knew what else. Taking the phone with her, she made her way along the short hallway to the kids' rooms and the stairs. Had he gone up to her bedroom? The room under the eaves they'd once shared? She was more in control now, her voice low and cold and steady. This is my space, Kate. Mine and the kids. One I carved out when you left. So you can't just walk in here uninvited. She pushed her hair from her eyes with her free hand. Her comment was met with silence, and she closed her eyes for a second, counted backward, mentally ticking off her heartbeats as she controlled herself. I was just worried, he finally said, his voice clipped. That's all. I know this is a tough day for you, and then on top of it, Mercedes writes that story. The first of a series about Luke, and Violet Sperry dies. Both were friends of yours. Okay, she said. Okay, look, I don't want to fight. Could have fooled me. Well, I was pissed, she admitted. We agreed to have boundaries. I was concerned, Rach, that's all. But I guess I shouldn't have been. You can obviously handle this and whatever else comes your way. With that, he hung up, the disconnect a distinct click in her ear. You're an idiot, that horrid voice reminded her. He's the kid's father. He was concerned, that's all. You don't have to always act like a damned shrew. Wounded party, she said aloud, arguing. Fine, then victim. No! So we're back to crazy person whose temper controls her tongue. Oh, shut up, she said aloud, and stormed back to the kitchen, where she opened the refrigerator, eyed the bottle of wine, and slammed the door shut. She still had a couple of hours before she picked up the kids, and then later she was off to Lila's for the damned meeting. Lila, ex-stepmommy dearest, and ex-BFF all rolled into one. She shook her head. Awesome. Pull yourself together. Let it all go. For God's sake, Violet's dead, possibly murdered. Remember, it was Violet's testimony that helped convince the judge that you weren't responsible for Luke's death. She provided one of the reasons for reasonable doubt, though the case never went to a jury. A new sadness chased away her anger at Cade. It was true. Violet, deeply myopic and not wearing glasses in the dark cannery that night, had sworn she'd seen a flash from a gun's muzzle just before Luke fell, and the flash had been near Rachel but not from her own gun. Violet's shaky testimony, coupled with the fact that there was no gunshot residue on Rachel's hands or clothes, had helped her defense. Some people thought she'd somehow washed her hands clean on the way to the station, that with her father's help she'd twisted the evidence to her advantage, which was wrong. She'd been numb after Luke had collapsed, yes, and had been grateful that her father had been first on the scene, but as much of a kaleidoscope of blurry, painful images and emotions as that night had become, she hadn't cleaned up. Those tissues her father had given her, to wipe her eyes and blow her nose, they hadn't been treated, and even so they wouldn't have destroyed the gunpowder residue. But then what did she really remember? Don't go there, not now. Not ever. It serves no purpose. Just get through this miserable day. Blam! The back of Dylan's head slammed against his locker and his teeth rattled in his jaw. Just do it! Brad Schmidt ordered. His face was pressed nose to nose with Dylan's, his strong fingers holding Dylan's shoulders in a death grip, his beefy body nearly on top of him. The rest of the hallway was deserted, except for Dash Parker, the lookout, standing at the juncture to the science wing. I can't, man. Dylan's back was pressed up against his locker. You have to. Schmidt's pupils dilated. His breath smelled of pizza, and the pores on his nose seemed enormous. You promised! He gave Dylan a shake for emphasis. In a letterman's jacket, black t-shirt, and camo shorts, Schmidt was furious, the nostrils on his nose flaring, his skin turning red. I'll get caught. Then find a way to not get caught, okay? You're a smart little shit. You'll figure it out. No, I think my mom is onto me. Then be fucking careful. Got it? Another hard shake. And it was all Dylan could do to stand his ground, to not pee his damned pants. Schmidt had a temper, a legendary temper that had only helped him become an all-conference tackle on the football team. We had a deal. I'm telling you, I can't. Brad's thick lip curled over his teeth, and his dark eyes narrowed. Who are you more afraid of, Ryder? Me or Mommy? She can be pretty badass. Not as badass as me, I'll bet. The thick fingers dug deep into Dylan's muscles. Remember that. Hey, Schmidt! Parker hissed, his head whipping around. He was tall and lean, a defensive end in football, third base in baseball, an all-around jock and a sycophant to Schmidt, which made him worse in Dylan's opinion. Walsh is coming! Shit! Marlene Walsh was a no-nonsense vice principal. Dylan had been busted by her on more than one occasion for cutting class. So far, nothing more serious. But Parker and Schmidt, who both, it was rumored, had scholarships to local colleges, couldn't afford trouble. Or so Dylan hoped. This isn't the end of it, Schmidt growled. He pushed Dylan hard against the locker again, then took off at a dead run, with the faster Parker leading the way to the staircase at the far end of the hall. Damn it, Dylan thought, caught between the ends of the hallway, one with the stairs at the front of the building, and Schmidt, the other with the ever-approaching Walsh. He heard the steady click, click of her heels as she headed this way. He wiped the sweat from his upper lip, turned, and opened his locker. Then, thinking about what was inside, he grabbed his algebra book, slammed it shut, and turned, facing the corner just as Walsh appeared. Well, Mr. Ryder, she said on a sigh and glanced at her watch. What are you doing skulking around the halls when you should be in class? She was a petite woman with gray streaks in her short blonde hair, rimless glasses, and a perpetually benign expression. Today, she was dressed in a red blazer with black pants and a white blouse. Dylan wasn't fooled by the smile that rained on him right now. Rumor had it that she'd earned a black belt in Taekwondo. He believed it. Beneath her harmless facade, there was an inner toughness. He could feel it. I've got study hall, he said, and tried to get past her. And you have a hall pass? No, couldn't lie about that. I see. He tried and failed, not to let his shoulders slump. You know, Mr. Ryder, you're skating on thin ice. If I'm not mistaken, this is the second time this semester when you've been out of class without a pass. How did she know these things? How could she keep track of it all in her head? There were like 800 or so kids in the school, and she knew how many times he'd cut. Come with me. She hiked her chin toward the front of the school to indicate the staircase where Schmidt and Parker had fled. Let's call your mother, she said. When he didn't respond, as he glumly tagged after her, she added, or maybe your dad. Dylan died inside. His parents, independently and together, would kill him if they found out he was ditching class. It's not my study hall. I know. You're supposed to be in Mrs. Marsden's English. Oh, God. Yeah. They reached the administration area, and Walsh led him between two desks to her private office, a small room with a single window looking out to the front lawn. Her desk was neat. A few piles of perfectly stacked papers, and her computer monitor along with a handful of pictures of her husband and daughter on one corner. Dylan knew. He'd been here before. Her framed degree hung on the wall behind her. Sit, she said, indicating one of the two visitors' chairs wedged between a bookcase and her desk. He did, and tried not to slouch as she took her own chair behind the desk. So, Mr. Ryder, how are we going to change this behavior? He hated the we almost as much as he detested being called Mr. It all seemed so phony, and come on, there was no we. He met her gaze. I won't cut again. I promise, he said, and she brushed off his words with a wave of her hand. We've been here before. That's what you said in October, I think. She adjusted her glasses, then typed on her keyboard and studied the computer screen. Oh, wait, I'm mistaken. It was the first week in November and then again in February, and now here we are. Again. 3 strikes. He didn't know what to say, but she filled in the awkward gap. As you have probably heard, the school district is retrofitting those old wings of the school with cameras, and it just hasn't happened yet because of budget problems and getting the right technician and all kinds of red tape. So what? He wondered, but was smart enough not to say it. I hear you're good at that kind of thing. Mr. Tallarico says you've got a natural talent for computers and cameras and all things technical. Yeah, he said slowly. Where was this going? So I was thinking, maybe you could help us out. His mind was racing. Was she offering him an out? So you wouldn't call my mom then? How lucky was this? Oh no, I'm calling her, of course. Again she offered him her trademark humorless smile. This is, after all, your third offense. She leaned back in her chair. So, what do you say? Sure, I guess. He kept expecting some trap, something more than a call to his mom, but it didn't happen. Good. Walsh gave a quick nod, as if agreeing with herself. You can start on Monday. Come and see me after school. She stood then, and the grilling was over as she said, I'm trusting you'll head straight to Mrs. Marsden's class. You won't pass go. You won't collect $200, and you'll avoid Mr. Schmidt and Mr. Parker as best you can. His mouth almost fell open. She knew? Without cameras, how? He didn't wait around and ask, but nearly knocked the chair over as he scrambled to get out of the tight, airless office. His mother was going to go through the roof, he decided, but for the moment, he'd avoided a serious beating from Schmidt. Right. And what are you going to do about him?